Good to have you with us this morning. I'm Joe Fryer.
And I'm Savannah Sellers. Thanks for being with us. We're going to begin this hour with the Arctic outbreak that's freezing most of the U.S. today. Tens of millions of Americans are under cold alerts from the Rocky Mountains down to the Gulf Coast. Temperatures in some states are expected to be, get this, more than 40 degrees below average, with possible sub-zero wind chills as far south as Arkansas and Texas.
The National Weather Service predicts for Virginia, this could be a top 10 snow event. Folks there still under a state of emergency from last week when some areas were devastated by severe flooding. Today, the governor warning people to stay off the roads. Meteorologist Angie Lastman is standing by with the forecast, but we start with NBC News reporter Gary Grumbach, who is live in Virginia Beach. Less beachy, more snowy going on there, Gary. Not a part of the country that historically gets a lot of snow, yet forecasters predicted up to 12 inches could fall where you are overnight. Talk about the conditions there.
Hey, good morning, guys. Yeah, we're on the Virginia Beach boardwalk. It is not a beach day, but it is indeed a snow day. As you mentioned, the snow itself has stopped falling overnight, but that's not before 10.2 inches of snow fell at Norfolk International Airport, making it the #8 snowiest day ever in Norfolk, Virginia, in the Hampton Roads area. So the snow is out of here, but the cold and the wind is what remains. And this snow is some light, fluffy stuff here. So what that means is that the roads are going to be continued to be covered with snow even after those crews get through it with plows, guys.
Gary, Virginia's governor said that state police officers and even the National Guard had been deployed to parts of the state that were still recovering from devastating floods last week and then hit with this storm. What is the biggest concern for officials right now?
Yeah, this is a 1-2 punch for Virginia, and emergency officials are all hands on deck here. We're talking about a 40% increase in emergency vehicles here in the Hampton Roads area, making sure that folks can get to where they need to be if they need to be there. But they're saying, hey, don't get on the roads. Overnight, Virginia State Police, I just spoke to them, they tell me they saw 200 crashes in the Hampton Roads area alone. That led to 10 injuries. So folks are just saying, stay off the road. Officials want you to stay off the road for today. Schools are out of school today, but they're not out of class because of the way technology works these days. The folks here in Norfolk and Virginia Beach all have virtual learning today. So the snowball fights will have to wait, guys.
Yeah, and the snow days of my childhood have been redefined. We didn't have virtual learning back then. All right, we've talked a lot, Gary, about the recent federal agency budget cuts, the freezes. Are those having any sort of impact on just how the U.S. government is able to help with these storms?
Well, this is going to be one of the first real tests, right? Governor Youngkin said this week that he's spoken to FEMA, he's spoken to the Department of Homeland Security, and he even spoke to the White House themselves. And he says the emergency money that they're going to need to clean all this up, and especially for that flooding in southwestern Virginia, he says they're going to get the money they need when they need it. But I think time will tell as it relates to that, guys.
All right, Gary Grumbach, we're going to let you try and get inside because it sounds windy there right now. Try and stay warm. Appreciate your reporting.
Well, let's bring in meteorologist Angie Lastman for a look at how winter's frigid and snowy weather is impacting so much of the country.
Hey, Angie, good morning.
Hi, good morning, guys. We've got some improvement with the winter alerts as compared to yesterday. You heard Gary mention that system is on the way out. We're going to see the snow wind down through the day today. We're not completely done with it just yet, hence why we still have some of these 36 million people under winter alerts at this time. But look what happens. We're going to see some of this kind of lake effect snow ramping up. We'll see some folks like places in Roanoke and Virginia Beach get another kind of quick batch of some of the snow. But the heaviest of it and that main system we are tracking is offshore, and that's going to continue to move away. Now, one thing that'll be left are the cold winds, and that's why we're going to deal with the lake effect snow across mainly portions of the Great Lakes. The highest totals are going to be downwind of those lakes here through the day today. As we look at the big picture, though, when it comes to cold, Gary mentioned it as well. The cold is not going anywhere anytime soon. We're going to still see nearly 100 million people this morning under these cold weather alerts. You can see they extend from top to bottom of the country and even out towards the East Coast. We've got a lot of folks dealing with really dangerously cold temperatures, specifically the farther north you are into parts of the plains and the Midwest. These are your temperatures right now. So 3 degrees for the actual temperature in Minneapolis, but who cares about that when we have wind to talk about? The wind chill -6. We've got 33 below across parts of the northern plains. Kansas City nearly 20 degrees below for what it feels like. And even places like Dallas, 13 degrees for your actual temperature, but you are feeling like 4 degrees below zero. So bundling up is the only option today. You're going to need all those extra layers if you have to get out the door. And temperatures even this afternoon, they don't look a whole lot better depending on where you are. Yes, we'll get to the 30s in Dallas, so I guess that's an improvement. 40s for places like New Orleans. But temperatures are still going to be single digits in Des Moines. We've got 20s for Indianapolis, and across the board, really even out towards the East Coast. These numbers are mainly 20 degrees plus below normal for this time of year. Even as we get into tomorrow morning, temperatures still bitter cold, especially in the middle of the country. 1 degree for Wichita tomorrow morning. We start to see some minor improvements for tomorrow. So notice Dallas is in the high 30s. We get Cincinnati into the low 30s. Washington, D.C., 39 degrees. But check out what happens by the time we see Saturday, Sunday, and specifically Monday roll around. That's when we'll see some major improvements. So we kind of start to thaw out as we get through the weekend. Cleveland, you start Saturday with an afternoon temperature of 31 degrees. But notice by Sunday, a big improvement, 36 degrees, woo, 41 degrees by Monday. That's going to feel balmy by all means, especially considering where we've been. Again, Minneapolis, 33 on Saturday. I know that doesn't sound great, near freezing, but you make it to the mid-40s by the time Monday rolls around. Similar story for New York City, upper 30s for your weekend plans on Saturday, but back to those mid-40s in New York by Monday. So we will start to see some milder conditions. I say mild, guys, because these are going to be just numbers that we should be seeing for this time of year. It's still winter. We still got a little ways to go before, of course, we see that major winter thaw. But in the meantime, we're going to need to bundle up for at least the next couple of days.
We're at that point where you can, like, every degree up, you can feel.
Yeah.
You're like, ooh, it's 28.
Yes, and the winds just are brutal. That's made it so much worse.
Yeah, getting up in the morning is just like...
It's been tough. You and me both.
Thanks, Angie.
This morning, the U.S. envoy to Ukraine, his name is Keith Kellogg, is meeting with President Zelenskyy in Kyiv. This face-to-face comes one day after President Trump escalated his feud with the Ukrainian leader.
Yesterday, President Trump ramped up his personal attacks on President Zelenskyy, falsely calling him a dictator without elections on social media. Mr. Zelenskyy was fairly elected back in 2019, but now elections have not been held since then due to martial law that was declared when the war with Russia started. The spat spiraled after Mr. Trump falsely suggested Ukraine was to blame for the war with Russia. President Zelenskyy then hit back, accusing President Trump of being, quote, trapped in a Russian disinformation bubble. The president later ramped up his criticism of Mr. Zelenskyy at an event in Miami last night.
A dictator without elections. Zelenskyy better move fast or he's not going to have a country left. Got to move fast because that war is going in the wrong direction. I love Ukraine, but Zelenskyy has done a terrible job. His country is shattered, and millions of people have unnecessarily died. And you can't bring a war to an end if you don't talk to both sides. You got to talk.
NBC News international correspondent Molly Hunter joins us now. So, Molly, this rift between Presidents Trump and Zelenskyy seems to be rapidly deepening. Many people questioning why all the criticism for Zelenskyy and not necessarily Russian President Putin. How did we get here? How is Kyiv reacting to these latest comments from Mr. Trump?
Right, guys, no criticism for President Putin, who is an actual dictator who's been in charge for about 25 years. But President Trump has never been particularly sympathetic to Ukraine, guys. If we go back a couple of years, even back in 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, as you guys rightly fact-checked the president, Trump praised Russia's, quote, genius move to put pressure on Ukraine and even called President Putin at that time very savvy in a radio interview. So some of this is not totally new. The recent, though, descent into chaos and kind of descent into this war of words, as you guys kind of laid out a little bit, started this week as the U.S. kicked off these peace talks without Ukraine President Saudi Arabia, and President Trump accused Ukraine of starting the war with Russia, and President Zelenskyy had to correct the record. Of course, it was Russia who launched a full-scale invasion into Ukraine in 2022, and Zelenskyy held his own news conference last night, and he says, as you guys mentioned, part of this quote, we have seen this disinformation, we understand that it is coming from Russia, and Trump lives in this disinformation space. Now, as President Trump continues to show this deference to Russia, flipping decades of U.S. policy on its head, you guys, I got to say, many of the headlines here in the UK, across Europe, wondering if this rift may be irreconcilable, and also what it means for the rest of Europe, for Ukraine's western flank going forward.
Molly, we also mentioned that the Trump administration's envoy to Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, is meeting with President Zelenskyy today. With this backdrop of tensions between the two leaders, of comments from both of them, what are we expecting from these talks?
Yeah, probably a little bit of awkwardness, but in his nightly update last night, President Zelenskyy attempted to move the conversation forward in some productive direction. He said, together with America and Europe, peace can be more secure, and that is our goal. But most importantly, this goal must be shared by our partners, not just by us. Now, U.S. Envoy Keith Kellogg also spoke yesterday about what his goals were while on the ground in Kyiv. Take a quick listen, and I'll talk to him back.
We understand the need for security guarantees. It was very clear to us the importance of sovereignty of this nation and the independence of this nation as well. And we're going to, part of my mission is to sit and listen and say, okay, what are your concerns? Well, yes, we can go back to the United States, talk to President Trump.
Now, Zelenskyy, for his part, said he hoped that Kellogg would walk around Kyiv and ask Ukrainians if they trust their president. Do they trust Putin? Let him ask about Trump, Zelenskyy said, what they think about the statements made by their president. So he's hoping that Kellogg actually gets a feel from the Ukrainian people about what it's like to be 3 years into war.
Molly, you mentioned those initial talks between U.S. and Russian officials in Saudi Arabia earlier this week. We're now getting Russian President Putin's reaction to that. What's he saying?
Right. The Russian president also spoke yesterday and said Ukraine would not be excluded, but the success of these talks would depend on trust between Moscow and Washington, not Moscow and Kyiv. He also said there was no reason to be, quote, hysterical that European and Ukrainian leaders weren't at the table this week. But I got to tell you guys, talking to European leaders, listening to European leaders this week, they feel excluded and very unhappy with how the U.S. is pushing ahead and kind of pre-negotiating these talks with just Russia.
All right. Molly Hunter. Molly, thank you so much.
Thanks, Molly. Well, let's turn to Washington now. The Pentagon is expected to be the next target of the Trump administration's effort to drastically shrink the federal workforce and slash funding. It comes as protests broke out in multiple cities against these mass firings of government employees. NBC News Chief White House correspondent Peter Alexander has more.
NBC News has learned Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is considering firing military generals and some of the department's most senior officers as early as this week, according to 2 defense officials and 3 congressional sources. Most of those targeted have been closely associated with former Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, who served under former President Biden, and have worked on DEI initiatives or have voiced opinions that Trump allies view as politically out of line with his agenda, the officials said. Late tonight, the Pentagon said Hegseth is looking to cut 8% of next year's defense budget, totaling around $50 billion. It comes as Elon Musk's Doge employees are now working inside the Pentagon, according to senior officials, eyeing staffing cuts there. Overnight, President Trump, alongside Musk, dismissed concerns about conflicts of interest with Musk's businesses, even though the tech billionaire's companies, like SpaceX, have massive contracts with the federal government.
If there's a conflict, he won't be involved. I mean, I wouldn't want that, and he won't want it.
First the mass firings, now the fallout. Across the country, growing protests opposed to the president's efforts to rapidly shrink the federal workforce. Jonathan Kamens was fired just days ago from his job overseeing cybersecurity for the VA's website.
Your firing has the potential to have a direct impact on the benefits American veterans receive, right?
So many veterans rely exclusively on VA.gov for accessing their benefits because it's difficult for them to get out of the house and get to a VA medical center. If VA.gov goes down, then those people can't get to their benefits.
Still, the president and his top lieutenant, both appearing today at a Saudi investment conference in Miami, are defending their reshaping of the federal government.
I think what we're seeing here is the thrashing of the bureaucracy as we try to restore democracy and the will of the people.
Musk also insisted the majority of federal workers are anti-Trump, noting D.C. is largely Democratic. But more than 80% of federal workers are not in D.C., spread throughout the rest of the country. The acting FAA administrator revealing in a letter to staffers today obtained by NBC News, special government employees who work for SpaceX have now visited the FAA's command center and will be going to other FAA sites to engineer solutions. While the administrator says the agency is keeping employees who perform safety-critical functions, its union says some FAA jobs already eliminated supported safety and airport operations.
All right, Peter, thanks so much. Well, Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy defended those firings, saying they did not impact air traffic controllers. But the president of the Professional Aviation Safety Specialists Union, those members serve as support staff to air traffic controllers. He's calling on the administration to stop additional cuts to the FAA's workforce, citing safety concerns. Well, as Trump looks to make these spending cuts at the Pentagon, Senate Majority Leader John Thune is working on a budget resolution that would boost defense spending in the latest budget battle between the House and the Senate.
The plan would also increase border security spending. It aims to give Mr. Trump a policy win, a legislative win, early in his first term. This could put pressure on House Republicans to join the Senate rather than work on a separate budget resolution, which risks taking longer to pass. But Mr. Trump is expressing his support for the House version. Writing on Truth Social, the House resolution implements my full America First agenda, everything, not just parts of it.
For more on this, let's bring in NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Melanie Zanona. Melanie, good morning. Thanks so much for joining us. So tell us more about what is in the Senate's plan and how Republicans in the Senate are reacting to Trump's comments of support for this House plan.
Yeah, good morning, guys. So this Trump endorsement of the House version of this bill was a real curveball for the Senate. I talked to a number of senators who said they were really surprised and caught off guard by those comments. Republicans, of course, they don't want to get ahead of Trump. They don't want to be doing anything that could be seen as disloyal or, sort of in defiance of him. So there were some serious questions yesterday about whether they were still going to proceed with their own version in the Senate. But they huddled with Senator J.D. Vance during a lunch yesterday. And during that meeting, J.D. Vance told senators they are okay at the White House with them proceeding in the Senate with their own plan, but only as a backup in case the House falls short. I want to play for you what John Thune, the Senate GOP leader, told reporters yesterday. Take a listen.
If the House can produce one big, beautiful bill, we're prepared to work with them to get that across the finish line. But we believe that the president also likes optionality.
So the Senate is full steam ahead. They are going to vote on their budget blueprint later today. There will be an opportunity for an unlimited number of amendments, including from Democrats. So that is going to be a long night. We are expecting them to work through it and ultimately pass this potentially in the wee hours of the morning. And it's just to remind you here, what the Senate is trying to do is they are just trying to get a quick win for the president. So their bill only contains money for the border, also some energy and defense money as well. And they were planning on saving the tax piece for later. But over in the House, they're worried with their slim margins. They only have the opportunity for one bite at the apple, so to speak. So they're trying to put everything into one big package. Of course, the question is whether the House actually can pass something. They have been whipping members, taking a temperature check all week. There are some concerns from moderates over potential Medicaid cuts to SNAP, but they are pushing ahead with their plan, putting it on the floor next week, guys.
Yeah, that's what I want to ask you about. I mean, Republicans have such a razor-thin majority in the House. What actually happens next on a resolution like this? As we described, it's a slower, longer process, right?
Yeah, exactly right. The first step is to pass this budget blueprint, as I mentioned. And remember, that is only the first step to unlocking this very complicated process called reconciliation. That is needed because they need that in order to get around the 60 vote threshold in the Senate. So both the Senate and the House have to pass the same budget blueprint. But then the committees have to actually get to writing the policy. And that's where it can get very complicated. As I mentioned, there's concerns about cuts to Medicaid, to food stamps, all of these critical programs that even some Republicans have constituents who rely on. So there is some nervousness, particularly among moderates, some of these Republicans who are competitive races. The leadership has been racing to work and win over these members ahead of their floor vote next week. But it's still very much up in the air whether the House is indeed going to be able to pass this on their own.
Melanie, while we've got you, we also want to ask you about these key Senate confirmation votes on the Hill later today we're expecting. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so we already saw some committee confirmation hearings this week, including for Lori Chavez-DeRemer. That is Trump's nomination to be the labor secretary. She is someone who actually, though, might need Democratic support to get over the finish line. And that is because she is facing some resistance from Republicans over her past support for labor unions and for organized labor, including some legislation that would have overturned right-to-work laws in Republican states. But during her confirmation hearing, she assured Republican senators that she no longer supports that bill and that she is determined to implement Trump's agenda. So she could be up next in the list of confirmations, and the Senate is quickly working through them on behalf of President Donald Trump.
All right, Melanie, and who's your guest star over your shoulder?
That is my dog, Bodie. He is a TV star. He can't help himself.
Hey, Bodie.
We hope Bodie can get comfortable and finally
he's really
lay down there.
Checking out all the available spots. Melanie, thank you very much and welcome to the team. Great to have you with us.
Thank you.
Farmers across the country are feeling the impact of President Trump's executive order freezing some federal funding. Critical government grants that some farmers were counting on are not getting paid out. NBC News correspondent Emily Ikeda spoke with a farmer in Maine who says he is now worried about the future of his business.
There's about 100 of them out there.
Kevin Levitt hopes these solar panels would help his Maine farm flourish.
The hope here is that these panels will produce enough electricity that the farm needs all year long.
He was only able to move forward with the pricey project because of a federal program that promised to shoulder roughly a third of the cost after completion. But the panels have been up and running for weeks and no sign of the $45,000 he's been counting on from the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Could you have ever imagined finding yourself in this position after taking on that agreement?
No, everything is in writing, everything's signed, you're stressed out, you're on edge. It has a toll on you.
President Trump has signed a flurry of executive orders pausing federal funding for review, including the Inflation Reduction Act, the climate initiative passed during the Biden administration. That has grant money built in for farmers like Levitt to conserve soil, water, and energy.
I can't get any answers.
Coast to coast, farmers who overwhelmingly supported Trump in November are voicing confusion and concern.
I've already done a bunch of the work, already paid for the material, already paid for the labor, so I'm out all that cost.
It's going to reach into every state and every community nationwide. That's how far the reach of the Department of Agriculture is.
A USDA spokesperson says Secretary Rollins is aware farmers have been waiting on payments during this government-wide review and is working to make determinations as quickly as possible, citing plans to share information later this week. Until then,
what do you want people in Washington to know?
Enforce the contract that they gave to us, that they gave to everybody else, and do what it says.
Or else what?
Or else there might not be farms.
Emily Ikeda, NBC News, West Gardner, Maine.
All right, now let's get to New York, where a federal judge has delayed making a decision on whether to drop the federal corruption case against embattled New York City Mayor Eric Adams.
At a hearing yesterday, Judge Dale Ho questioned a top Trump Justice Department official who ordered federal prosecutors to dismiss the charges last week. That official said that the case against Adams threatened to interfere with national security and immigration enforcement. At least 8 prosecutors have resigned in protest. Adams was indicted in September on 5 counts, including soliciting illegal foreign campaign donations, bribery, and fraud. Now, at that hearing, Mayor Adams told the judge he has not committed a crime. NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalos is here to help break it all down. So we should note, the former head of the Manhattan Federal Prosecutor's Office, who also resigned, is basically saying this is a quid pro quo. That's the accusation here. The mayor gets the charges dropped. In return, the Trump administration gets help with their immigration enforcement here. For the judge, what is the judge trying to figure out here? What's the line of questioning? What is it the judge is able to do?
Federal prosecutors can dismiss their own case, but the rule requires leave of court. Now, what does that mean? Historically, it's not supposed to be a rubber stamp, but practically speaking, it is a rubber stamp because what is a judge going to do? But judges have pushed back in the past. A good example is the prosecution of General Michael Flynn during the Trump administration. Flynn, though, had actually pleaded guilty when the Trump administration tried to withdraw the prosecution. It was in a different procedural posture, so in theory, because he'd already pleaded guilty, they could proceed to sentencing. This case has not even gotten to trial yet. So while in theory the judge can put a lot of evidence on the record, and the Flynn case tells us he could appoint a special prosecutor type person to litigate the issue. He could invite amicus briefs from professors or people who have opinions about this. But ultimately, practically speaking, this case is likely going to go away. The judge can put a lot of facts on the record, but it just isn't tenable to force the DOJ to continue with a prosecution that DOJ no longer wants to prosecute.
So let's say it is dismissed. Is there any way for Manhattan or New York State prosecutors to salvage this case against Adams at all?
Yes, in theory, but practically speaking, it's not likely. Not so much because New York couldn't come up with similar crimes. There are bribery and corruption crimes under state law as well as federal law. But The challenge becomes, I think, political, because if the Manhattan DA's office ramps up an investigation and prosecution now, it won't look so great. It will look very political, which is the exact issue in this case, is whether or not this is not only a political prosecution, but a political dismissal.
All right, let's talk about another big headline that came out of yesterday. This involves New York City's congestion pricing. So the Secretary of Transportation, Sean Duffy, told New York Governor Kathy Hochul he's terminating the DOT's agreement to allow the program. President Trump then celebrated this news on Truth Social, declaring, quote, congestion pricing is dead, and saying, long live the king. A White House aide then later shared this AI-generated image of Trump appearing as a monarch. That aside, this is a controversial program that New Yorkers have been talking about like crazy over the last several weeks. It involves being charged when you come into the city, entering parts of Manhattan. Governor Kathy Hochul says, we're going to see you in court, Mr. Trump. What happens here? How could this play out?
Yeah, forget Republicans and Democrats. For New Yorkers like us, there is no more divisive issue than this congestion pricing. Some people love it. Some people hate it. What this is not, though, this is not the federal government giving a state government or a municipality a direct order to cease congestion pricing. Then you might run into some supremacy clause issues. You might run into some constitutional issues. You still do run into constitutional issues with this. Don't get me wrong. But this is a little more nuanced. Instead, the federal government is saying the agreement that the prior administration entered into to allow this congestion pricing was no good, and they're going to reevaluate it. And so that's really what's going on. If you look back historically, federal highways are supposed to be free. There are exceptions to that. I can think of 76 in Pennsylvania. But for the most part, federal highways are supposed to be free. One of the chief complaints of the administration is that this congestion pricing has no free alternative. There's no, you can't drive north to US 80 and drive that toll free if you want to avoid 76. Here, everyone who comes in has to pay the pricing. The federal government says that is not proper. So it's looking at all these different reasons why it should be able to stop congestion pricing.
All right, Danny Savalas, thank you.
This morning, federal authorities are investigating yet another deadly aviation incident. This time it happened at an Arizona airport. At least 2 people were killed in a midair collision between 2 small planes. NBC News correspondent Jesse Kirsch has the details.
This was the scene in rural Arizona, charred debris littering this airport outside Tucson after a deadly midair crash.
Small aircraft fully involved in fire.
According to the NTSB, just before 8:30 a.m. local time, 2 small private planes, a Lancer and a Cessna, were flying near the Marana Regional Airport when they collided midair. The FAA says 2 people were on board each aircraft. And while federal investigators say the Cessna landed uneventfully, the Lancer crashed, catching fire. Local officials confirm 2 people are dead. Both planes were flying over what's known as an uncontrolled field that has no air traffic control tower.
Small airplanes go in and out of uncontrolled fields frequently. They depend on radio positions to tell each other where the airplanes are, and also visually to watch out for other airplanes. Similar to driving a car, you look outside to make sure you don't hit anything.
This has been a troubling year for American aviation. Last month, 67 people were killed when an American Airlines jet and a military chopper collided over Washington, D.C. Then earlier this week, a Delta airliner flipped over as it landed at Toronto Pearson International Airport on Monday. At least 18 people were injured. Officials say efforts have begun to remove the plane from the runway, which should improve traffic delays at one of North America's busiest airports. Jesse Kirsch, NBC News.
Well, in Missouri, prosecutors say a man has died just days after pleading guilty to shooting a black teenager who mistakenly rang his doorbell. 86-year-old Andrew Lester was awaiting sentencing after accepting a plea deal on Friday for shooting Ralph Yarl in the head back in 2023. You might remember that shooting sparked nationwide protests and demands for Lester's arrest. Lester had pleaded guilty to 1 count of second-degree assault and faced up to 7 years in jail. Prosecutors did not say how he died. Yarl's family telling NBC that Lester never apologized and delayed his trial to avoid taking accountability.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.